Hi, and welcome to the I T'd Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 42. What can the answer teach us about diagnostic principles? So, the answer. What is it? 42. It's the answer to everything. That's it. That's it. That's the thing. No, I'm kidding. The answer is, I don't know if you've ever called into IT or watched the IT crowd or just done IT for any length of time, but often the answer is, have you turned it off and turned it back on again? And for a wide range and vast majority of issues that people might be running into, this is a solution. It resolves any issue and creates, it just does the thing that it just resets everything and it gets people back to where they're working. But why? That's a really, it seems like a really dumb thing for people not to try, and a pretty easy solution to really just fix everything. So why does it work? Why does this happen? Well, so when we look at this, when we look at specific problems and we're trying to do diagnostics. So if you don't understand what diagnostics are, diagnostics is the determination of the cause of a problem. And you can take your car in for diagnostics. You can go in for a diagnosis from your doctor. You can perform diagnostics on really any problem. And when you are doing this, the things that you are attempting to identify can vary depending on what you're working on and depending on what the problem is. And it can be very difficult. In fact, there are just tons and tons of classes and seminars and books for doctors to teach them how to properly diagnose patients. Like, there's a whole diagnostic process that they follow through. And what I find interesting in the IT world is there doesn't seem to be necessarily that same level of attention paid to diagnostic principles, but it's kind of key for you to have this as a good IT person. Now, you can be a regular an IT person and maybe a good one as well, but if you aren't doing any sort of diagnostics and really just fixing problems as they come up and sort of just treating symptoms, you're never going to reduce your workload. Those of us who have been in IT a while and can automate things and plan and readily identify problems before they come up are typically using diagnostic principles. And what does this mean? Like, you keep skirting around this issue. What the fuck does it mean? So diagnostic principles are basically, the principle of diagnostics is that a problem has a cause. There is never an issue. There's never a symptom that does not have a cause. And it is important to identify that a symptom is separate from the cause. And this is most notably a problem in medicine because doctors can treat the symptom and not the illness. And where you get something like this, for instance, is that if you have an illness like cancer and you are puking and the doctor only treats your puking, then they're not really treating the cancer, and you're just going to continue to get sicker and sicker. So that's an example of this. Another example of this is in the IT world is, I have a computer that's constantly blue screening. Well, if I turn it off and I turn it back on again, it works for about 15 minutes and then it blue screens again. But man, it works really great for that 15 minutes. That's another treatment of the symptom and not the problem. So how do we get beyond that? How do we understand what is a symptom and what is the cause? How do we get to that? And that is what that's what the principles of diagnostics are supposed to teach you how to do. And without knowing a specific problem, it can become very difficult to tell you necessarily how to diagnose that problem. But what we can do is we can create sort of a framework for diagnostics. And what we want to do is you want to walk a problem through kind of a flow chart. And when you are first starting out with IT, this can be very difficult to do because you don't necessarily understand how systems are interconnected and how things work. And it can be very difficult. When you get more experience and when you dive deeper into IT, it can be a lot easier and it can make things a lot simpler. But one of the things that makes diagnostic principles a little harder is that specifically with IT, you have to have experience in everything that you're working on. In medicine, you don't necessarily have to be a doctor who has a specialty in oncology to identify cancer. But in IT, if you don't have an idea of how the inner workings of an application are, you might not be able to identify that there's a bug in the code. It's just going to be a problem that really just occurs for an annoying reason, and you're not really going to be able to identify that. So I'm going to do all of the listeners who might be medical oriented a favor, and I'm going to stop making comparisons to medicine right at this moment. So anyways, in diagnostic principles for IT, what we want to do is we want to try to identify we want to try to create branching scenarios. And so, for instance, if a device doesn't power on, we have to identify what the potential causes of that are and sort of go through a flowchart of how to diagnose the cause of the problem. And so for this, if we say that we have a computer that will not power on, we have to identify a few things. First, identify that the device is plugged in. Is it plugged in at all? If it's not plugged in, well, that's a really good indication of why your device isn't powering on. However, it's powered on, and if it's got power going to it, a known good power cable from a known good socket, and we know that it's supposed to power on, we press the power button and nothing happens, then we know the problem exists somewhere internal to the computer. Whereas if it were the power cable or the outlet or something like that, it would be an external problem. So split it from external and internal. Is it internal to the problem? Is it internal to the device, or is it external from the device? Next, if it's internal to the device, then we need to identify what particular component within that device might be affected. Now, one really good test on most modern computers at some point is that the power supply comes with some sort of indicator that it is receiving power, either a small little blue light or some, if you've got a 1600 watt power supply in your gaming rig, it probably has an LED screen on it that's telling you all sorts of really fucking awesome facts about each pole on the goddamn power lane or whatever. You probably have some indication that it's receiving power. If not, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. Back in the old days, I'd say just whip out your multimeter, but finding somebody with a multimeter is like finding somebody who still drives a manual car. I'm sure there are people still out there who drive manual cars, but they're few and far between. At any rate, once you identify whether or not the power supply is receiving power, then you can work your way further internal into the machine. So what's the next component that could possibly be failing? Well, it could be the motherboard. Well, how do we test the motherboard? Well, you have to figure that out. And basically, you work your way into a position where you identify which component is failing. Then inside of that, if you want, you can identify a subcomponent or replace the failing component, and eventually you'll have a working device again. For instance, one of the things that often happens, this is a example that has happened more often than I care to admit, but say for instance you have a computer, it powers on, and then something happens. It can be a laptop or a desktop. Something happens, you press the power button maybe one too many times in quick succession. There's a lightning strike near you. You're playing with the power supply or the surge protector, and the computer shuts off. And when you plug it back in and get the power stable and you press the power button, it just doesn't work. And you unplug it, you unplug everything and plug it back in, and it still doesn't work. And the issue ends up being that the motherboard itself is in surge protect mode. And what this mode is it's basically where the motherboard is like, I received some sort of power surge. I am not turning on until I am completely drained of power. And so what you have to do is you have to unplug everything from the motherboard or unplug every power source from the motherboard and hold down the power button so that it will drain the power naturally. And then once that happens, typically it only takes 30 seconds for this to happen. Once that happens, you can plug it back in and it will magically just turn on. Without knowing that as a potential outcome, it can be very difficult for you as a troubleshooter to diagnose the issue. So working it from that backwards, forwards, or outside in approach can help identify that. Another example where we kind of get into a little bit more of a branching scenario is if you're troubleshooting software. One of the things that is difficult to identify are issues within software, specifically when a user is experiencing them. A single user is experiencing them. For instance, let's say you have a user who utilizes a specific piece of software. They're bringing in an appointment. When they sign the customer in for the appointment, it takes a long time. It takes 5 minutes for it to load the patient or the customer or their record or whatever. And this user is always like, every time I load a customer, it slows down like this. It's really difficult to work because I have to wait for 5 minutes while it does its thing. And you go in and they insist that it's a problem with the server. So you go in and you identify, okay, the server's still running. There's no major slowdowns, and you have to do a resource dump to identify if there's any issue with the resources. You push the server onto a new host because it's a VM, so on and so forth, until you get to the point where you're like, I've tried everything to make this better. What the hell is the problem? Well, that is kind of a breakdown of the diagnostic process because there was nothing done to identify if it could have been internal to the software. So one of the things that when you're looking at this, if it's a single user and not everybody in the organization that's experiencing this, you can pretty much identify right then and there it's not the server. It's not the source of the data that is causing the issue. Something the user specifically is doing is causing the problem. Now, when does this occur? Does it only occur with a specific instance? Does it occur only with specific action? Are there multiple actions that cause this slowdown? Where exactly? Let's create a bounds of the problem. Let's create some bounds within the issue. So with all that data, you can then kind of identify where maybe there be an issue. You know, there are a lot of causes to this type of problem. One could be that the user has a temporary customer that they create, that they load all of the data into for a customer and then export so that they can import it into the actual customer file. And that temporary customer entry that they're using is bloated, and because it has all the data from all customers this user has ever seen. It could also be things like the specific user is attempting to utilize a plugin that either doesn't exist or is incompatible with the current version. The user could have some limitation on their permissions, and so it's timing out whenever it's attempting to do a specific thing that is non-critical to the operation of the user. so on and so forth. So there's a ton of causes that could be this issue. And so understanding where the bounds are around the problem will help you identify where next to approach. Now, when you are doing this sort of diagnostic approach, it helps to understand that if there is a quick fix for it, that can also help you identify what the source of the problem is. So treating the symptom can often be a good solution to help you identify the bounds of the problem. So powering a machine off and on again, if that resolves it, then you know there's something about the state of the machine before and after the reboot or power on, power off, or power off, power on cycle that either causes the problem or solves the problem. So, memory leaks and CPU thread crawl, things like that are all possible issues within a piece of software. And knowing and understanding that how to treat that and spot that quickly will help you in your diagnostic process. So again, when you are doing a diagnostic process, when you're going through this, you want to create your bounds of the problem. Look external versus internal, and try to break it down from there. So if it's external, then you can identify the source of the issue, and then once you've identified the source, then you can troubleshoot that source. If it's internal, then you identify the component within the internal mechanisms of whatever you're attempting to troubleshoot, and walk down the bounds and attempt to identify the cause of the issue. It can be difficult to do this, again, without understanding the full breadth and scope of what you're working on. If you don't know how a software works, if you don't know how a piece of hardware is supposed to function, it can be difficult to perform these diagnostic processes because you don't have any direct feedback, and you may not know how to get that direct feedback from that specific device or solution to tell you that there's a problem. Now, why does powering off and powering it back on fix so many things? Why is it the answer? Well, powering a thing off and powering it back on does a ton of different things. First off, it does clear out any lingering memory or thread or handle utilization within the operating system of the computer. So if there's an issue with resource management or resource availability, rebooting a machine can often fix any issue that may result from that. Beyond that, rebooting a machine also resets the state of any temporary files that may be in there. It can resolve a lot of issues with temporary files being hung or being locked. And there's also scenarios where there might be a race condition being set up where you have two separate entities of equal authority attempting to access a specific file. For instance, this happens a lot with antivirus scanners and system integrity monitors. If you have a system integrity monitor on your machine and you have an antivirus, and your antivirus and your system integrity monitor attempt to scan the same exact file at the same time, well, which one wins out? They both have equal authority to scan that, but they each lock each other out of that file. And so they will sit there and fight over that file, attempting to maintain control or gain control of the file with any means necessary. And so that can also cause issues with the system and significantly challenge the system. Another reason why rebooting a system, specifically in Windows and domain environments, the reason why that can resolve issues is because of the ticket granting ticket system and Kerberos authentication. I went over all of that in one of my previous episodes where we talked about how Kerberos authentication and ticket granting tickets only typically last 2 weeks before you have to renew it. And if you don't actually log back into a machine and you're only locking it and unlocking a computer, you may not renew that ticket granting ticket, which can then cause issues with authentication within within a domain environment. So rebooting a machine causes you to have to log back into that machine instead of necessarily just locking and unlocking a machine. Beyond that, powering it off and powering it back on again also allows you to basically cause the computer to take a breather. I know that's kind of a weird way to say it, but you're giving the computer a chance to cool down. A lot of issues with hardware specifically are temperature. And if you're constantly running your CPU at a high rate or whatever, and the temperature's burning through the actual hardware, like the actual components of the hardware, that can definitely cause significant issues. And so if you're working with a ton of things that break like that, rebooting and turning it off, turning it back on again can have a significant impact. In regards to things like printers or, any other stupid piece of shit that you might be working on, those devices often have some sort of buffer that only gets cleared when you reboot the machine. And so turning those off and turning them back on clears that buffer and can result in better operation further and foremost. So while, like I said earlier on, while turning things off and turning it back on again can be an answer, can be a solution for a lot of problems, it may not be the actual resolution of the source of the problem. And it may only be prolonging or encouraging the suffering of whatever you're working with, or basically just a Band-Aid over a problem and not really solving the underlying issue. So again, when you're working with diagnostics and when you're attempting to solve a problem and you need to understand how to approach it, again, look for the bounds of the issue. Understand exactly what kind of situation you're attempting to work on. If you do not have that information, it becomes almost impossible to troubleshoot. Because if you don't understand what your limitations are as far as the problem is, then everything is possible. And that is a problem. And you will spin your wheels forever for simple problems. That's all I have for today, guys. And I hope you guys have a great day. Don't forget to bring your towel.